The year is 1986, and we follow a family battling against a pack of ravenous alien creatures called Krites that escaped from an intergalactic prison and crash land on Earth. These small, furry monsters may look cute at first glance, but they're lethal, equipped with razor-sharp teeth and a vicious appetite. As the Krites wreak havoc, a pair of shape-shifting alien bounty hunters arrive to hunt them down, adding chaos and dark humor to the mix. Combining elements of horror, comedy, and science fiction, Critters stands out for its practical effects, campy tone, and fast-paced action. Though often compared to Gremlins due to its mischievous little creatures, Critters carves its own niche with a grittier, more B-movie charm that features a cast chock full of genre greats like M. Emmett Walsh, Dee Wallace, Scott Grimes, and Billy Zane. This week on Back to the Balcony, we cover Stephen Herrick's Critters. Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert, two titans of cinematic review. Sometimes right, sometimes wrong, but always captivating. Your hosts Antonio of the Cult-Worthy Cinema Podcast and Justin Henson of the Movie Wire are here to take you back to the balcony. Stephen Herrick, director of Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure and Mr. Holland's Opus, which we've already discussed. And I think that was like a great projection for him, this being his debut film, and then winding up to do, I mean, not an Oscar-worthy, in my opinion, but an Oscar Beatty type film with Mr. Holland's Opus. And yeah, I think that's a really cool track record for him. But I think this is a great debut. I think that this, like I said, in the mid-'80s, you had all these little creature features, Ghoulies, Munchies, Gremlins, Critters. But I think Critters kind of stood out on its own for being a little bit more dangerous, a little bit more ferocious, less slapstick humor, but a lot more 1950s kind of B-movie genre film. And that's exactly what it is. So I like Critters. What's your opinion?
I love Critters. I love the entire franchise for what it is.
Me too, brother.
Like, it just crescendos into just beyond ridiculous, and I love every movie to its own charm, I should say. But here is a director that you mentioned goes for Oscar bait. I think the opposite. He knows what an audience wants. This is a director that really went from Bill and Ted's, Mr. Holland's Opus, 101 Dalmatians, Life, or something like it, Man of the House, whatever it may be. He just wants to have a good time. And this one is a brilliant introduction to what we're going to see from this director, where we see, and you stole my line, as usual, the 50s sci-fi vibe of this movie, where we get a little bit of universe building, we get a little bit of that farmhouse that you'll see in 50 comic books of a family in danger from the aliens. So there's a little bit of everything here to really build something that I don't think the franchise took advantage of per se, but I think it is a good stamp on what this director is going to do in the future, which is appease an audience.
What I love about the 80s as well, and, you know, directors like Joe Dante and especially Tobe Hooper with Invaders from Mars, like there was like this kind of throwback to the 50s movies and even like the old Universal monster films with movies like Monster Squad. Even Night of the Creeps from Fred Decker has a lot of like 50 throwback to it. It even has like a flashback scene in the 50s in black and white. There was just something about that nostalgia. And I think about it now, it's like, okay, in the mid-'80s, they were making movies with themes and ideas that were 30 years prior. And if we were to do that now, we'd be talking about movies in the 90s, right? But the 90s aren't as interesting as the 50s. The nostalgia's not as much there. It's a lot of day glow and neon, and we've already seen them do that with a lot of different kind of throwback movies or ideas to it. I still think the 80s is the decade that people just really want to cling to. Stranger Things, right? It just works. I think the idea of the technological advantages of doing things in the 80s before cell phones and internet and stuff like that makes it a good decade for some good sci-fi and horror throwback. Putting it in the 80s really, really works, right? So with this one, I love the idea that, yes, they're taking the modern day sensibilities and violence and gore and kind of rib poking satire of the sci-fi genre with humor, essentially doing what Gremlins did, but making it a little bit meaner, right? Less funny, a little bit more mean. But I think the personality of these krites, of these critters, I think work differently than what Gremlins does because they are a hive mind, but yet they have personality. Where the whole idea of Gremlins is each and every gremlin has its own personality, its own kind of cartoonishness to it. And while Gremlins was a larger scale, this one is a lot smaller. It's isolated pretty much to the farm and the small little town that it's in. And that kind of adds to the 50s nostalgia of it. It's like you don't want to venture too far out because then you have to expand your story. They do it perfectly in Critters 2, which I think is my favorite Critters film of them all, but it's got to start somewhere, and this is the way to go.
No, I 100% agree. Like Critters 2, I was going to mention, is my favorite in compared to the original. And I think where, if I were to say a fault with this movie, is that it spends most of its time in the darkness, where when it comes to practical effects, personality, and compared to Gremlins, the 80s really did have audiences flock to theaters to see, are we going to like the creatures? Are we going to like the practical effects? It doesn't really matter about the characters per se, but in Critters, we actually do like a lot of the characters here. We do like the family element, but I think this one really didn't actually explore what this could have been with the setting in complete darkness, because we get the big critter, we get the crescendo of it, but it spends little to no time exploring this or exploring the universe in the beginning with the bounty hunters or et cetera, et cetera. This one almost seems like it was preempted to say, we're going to do a sequel, even though this is a cheesy movie. We don't know where it's going to go. So this one did take a huge risk on where it was going to spend its time, spend its money on sequels, but the sequels didn't really explore even further to satisfy an audience. But at the end of the day, I think this one, with its practical effects, it was brilliant on not showing everything up front and center. But at the same time, it didn't lean into that 50s cheesiness because we couldn't see the creatures. Everything is so dark. We get moments of the creatures in their own language saying fuck, swearing. And I wanted more of that to really.
With subtitles.
With subtitles. I think when we take movies like this and compare to something that is so apparent, like Eight-Legged Freaks, that really did lean into that 50s element, that cheesiness, this could have really gone further when it comes to that. But make no mistake, it's still a fun ride.
You know, I was thinking about this too as I was watching this film, that the idea of having not just like the ideas and the tropes of 50s sci-fi, the way they cast this movie is very like 50s TV show sitcom, especially with Don Keith Opera's Charlie, the kind of like bucktooth yokel guy. Then you've got Billy Greenbush as the dad who looks like he's straight out of a 50s sitcom. But then you have like more modern performances from the younger kids. Scott Grimes, in particular, as Brad, the main guy who would later go on to be the voice of Steve Smith on American Dad, and the dad in the new Ted series. Like, he's kind of been around forever, and he's great in this. Then you've got a very young Billy Zane in one of his first roles as like the boyfriend who gets his fingers bitten off, right? Just fun. I think it's a great way to introduce him into the horror world, which I think met its apex in Tales from the Crypt Demon Knight. You know, he just kind of kept along those, you know, the cool guy in the horror movie theme. But the cast about this is great. Emmett Walsh, one of my favorite that guy actors, is Harv. I mean, this is one of the guys that you could put him in any movie. Put him in Blood Simple as the private detective. Put him in Blade Runner as the chief of the Blade Runner police, right? And then put him in this as the small town sheriff. He works in everything, and he really adds some credibility to it. And then, of course, like the cream of the crop, you've got Dee Wallace as the mom. E.T.'s mom in Critters as the mom from Cujo. I mean, if there isn't a better horror film mom than Dee Wallace in anything, She's got Howling cred. She's got Frighteners cred. Like, there really is a stacked cast of genre actors that just make this movie that much better. And we've talked about this before. New Line Cinema was amazing at this. You know, these are the guys that decided, okay, we can make a sequel to any horror movie if it makes $5. And they did. They made 4 of these and a series, right? New Line built the house of Nightmare on Elm Street. We had so many of those because they knew if they could make at least a little bit of profit, they could keep building on that. New Line Cinema built the idea of multiple sequels for horror films, and this was just in the perfect space for it. And I think it's weird. It was complete coincidence that I brought 2 New Line Alien films back to back. I brought The Hidden and then I brought Critters. Didn't even mean to, but I did. So yeah, that's what I have to say about like the formula that makes this movie and this series special.
The cast here, there's no bad performances here. I think if I were to nitpick, and you know I'm gonna nitpick, is when it comes to Walsh's character, I think towards the climax, it feels a little bit wasted, where he just gets thrown out of a window when he's just trying to help, and he's just kind of inserted here and there as the sheriff. But again, you can go back and forth and debate saying that's part of the 50s charm of it is you have the dopey unfamiliar sheriff that really explores, doesn't know what's going on, and he's just reacting to situations, and that's what we get here. But it's hard to have a strong performance and a strong actor and say just do the same thing that we've seen from films past, because he
Right.
is a strong
We just
actor.
want you to be that guy.
Yeah, you almost want to root for the sheriff on this one because you love Walsh so much. But it's funny because last night I did a rewatch and I fell asleep to it on Tubi. And I woke up at 3 a.m. and Leonardo DiCaprio is fighting the critters. I have Charlie fighting in number 2 or 3. So I went
Mhm.
through a marathon of critters last night, and these are B movies that have great performances with a great history of casting. And I went back, and today, before 4 o'clock, I woke up at 8 a.m. after binging the critters and watched the entire series. And it made me appreciate this even more. Of going back to where this movie started. And like I said in the original, there is a charm to every single one. Not every single one's good, but it holistically as a series just works when it comes to building a universe that could have gone a little bit further, but as the cheesiness of tradition, it works.
I mean, dude, I even remember being like 11, 12 years old and Critters 4 hit HBO and it's an early Angela Bassett in the shower. I was like, who is this Amazon goddess? And I've been a fan ever since, you know? And here she is, Critters 4, one of her first films. Critters 3, one of Leonardo DiCaprio's first performances. Like, this movie makes stars. I'm going to say one of my favorite things, and I already knew this before that, but one of my favorite little nuggets, and we could call it a connection to another film that we've done in the podcast history. We've got Terrence Mann as Johnny Steele, the bounty hunter who shapeshifts into the rock star in this one, and then he plays a character named Ugg, essentially the same character in the second one. That's Larry, the choreographer from Chorus Line. And I think that is such a great connection, right? Like, we've done 2 Terrence Mann movies unintentionally on Back to the Balcony, and where we said that Larry was one of the best parts of Chorus Line, well, him as Johnny Steele is one of the best parts in Critters. Totally different role, totally different type. They're kind of like the Kyle Reeses of this, right? They're here to hunt the Krites down. Yeah, so I think that's my other little fun nugget of like, oh, Terrence Mann is in this movie, and yeah, he does a great job, and consistently throughout the series coming back. So
Same can go with Charlie, one of our writers here that
yeah,
goes throughout the series. Like, he is one of the familiar characters that we get that goes through the series that honestly, here we could have gotten a little bit more. And again, I'm the Debbie Downer here that as we reflect, we lean so much into that 50s piece of it that this series could have been a lot more, but at the same time, it's satisfying. And that's what is a little bit frustrating with me when we go and watch all these movies of the Critter series is this tries to have influence from almost like our critics are going to say, Terminator. What I'm going to say, even Star Wars, when it comes to alien creatures going into it. So this has a lot of influence from not just the 50s, but early 80s movies, 70s movies that really influence where this universe wants to go. And it's kind of disappointing to me that we don't really get to see that full universe built, that we go to the end of the franchise and it's just cheesy. But I will say this is it's still fun. I have to go back to that, and it's hard for me to go back and forth with the tug of war between what it could have been and what it's fun. Critters 2, and I again agree with you. Critters 2 is a big one because I think that Easter Bunny scene really did traumatize me at a different level as a kid. But I think it did crescendo into what tapped into fear and more of the creatures than it did the characters as we got in this one.
Yeah, and that's one of the weird things. Like it's almost like Reservoir Dogs, where I think my memory, or I should say, collected memories of the Critters films with this one is that this one is not as cruel as the sequels. It's not as violent. I think there's like only maybe 2 or 3 death by critters in this. The cow gets eaten, right? So it's not like the second one where it's like body after body after body after body. There's only a few deaths in this. Most of it is mischief. So the cruelty, I was like, oh yeah, I forget. This one's not as violent as the subsequent ones. And it doesn't have to be. I also think budget has a lot to do with it too. Like this being the first one, being a very modest budget, being very DIY. And I miss the practical effects days. Like the practical effects, they're puppets. They're obviously puppets. But they make the puppets so obvious that you're in on the joke, right? They're not trying to pass it off as like, look at these great special effects. It's not like what they did in Gremlins, where Gremlins, they really tried to make those Gremlins realistic. These are literally, essentially sock puppets on some dude's hand. I was reading in some of the special trivia, some of the fur on these things were actually merkins that they bought at a local sex store because they needed more fur on these things. Like, that's how DIY this movie was. And that's what makes it a little bit special, is that you can tell the effort in the production.
Well, I think that's what's so special about movies of the 80s, especially creature features, because as I watched it, I almost wanted to go back to watch 1984's Ghoulies, where you're
Yeah.
not seeing there for the characters, you're seeing there for the creatures and how realistic it is or how goofy it is. And that's part of the fun factor of going to a movie of this decade of creatures is we know it's not going to look real. The filmmakers aren't going to try and make it look real unless it's like a high budget alien movie. This one is just there for midnight madness fun, and it just works because when even though it's dark, we can see the fortes of the red eyes. We can see the stares with wind blowing behind the creature's fur. We can see the special darts coming out of their neck at some point. We forte the danger aspects of this with practical effects and editing. So that's what this movie really is just that midnight movie fun where we have a farmhouse, a secluded environment, and we have aliens that always seem to go to this farmhouse because it is secluded, not a big city. So real there's some realization to this where we do have some fun with where we can almost see the critters on the front of a comic book and see the fun factor to it.
Yeah, 100%. I think the last thing I would say about the movie, like pacing wise, there are some slow moments, and that's granted. But I think what really works for me in this is the fact that like it takes itself extremely seriously as a movie, yet with the effects, it's really like self-explanatory of like this is not anything big budget. Like we're gonna let you in on the joke of how practical this is, and you're gonna get a laugh out of it. But you're also going to get some thrills. And like I said, there's just something about this decade where they were making horror films that were, I would say, marketed to adults with the hope and the intent that kids were going to sneak into the theater and see it. That kids were going to stay up after their parents went to bed and watch it on cable, or they were going to get someone to rent it for them at Blockbuster. Like they knew that there were multiple generations that wanted to watch this film for different reasons. And I feel like that is something that we lost in the Blockbuster era of the 90s, where we stopped making movies a little bit too dangerous for kids, but just safe enough that they'd seek it out. And then all of a sudden in the 90s, we just wanted to make everything safe for everybody. And yeah, I don't know. I miss the 80s. I miss the down and dirty 80s.
I completely agree. I miss the 80s because even this one's a prime example where our critics are going to talk about it, but we don't have blood and guts. We don't have the horror of it. But even more so, when we get to the climax, it has a happy ending.
It does.
It really does. And it makes no sense whatsoever. But you know what? It's okay because it makes us feel good. And I love the point that you said that kids are going to sneak into this movie. And the filmmakers almost anticipated that because it does have that moment at the end where we leave this creature feature, this horror movie, and we just feel good because it all works out until we see the tag, the setup for the second one with the eggs. But that still feels good because at least they giggle within the eggs. So I think this one really does cater to the taboo of kids going to movies without parents knowing, and it's almost a wink to adolescence that it's okay.
Right. And again, one of my favorite New Line in jokes of all time is the fact that in Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, when Raphael sneaks out to go see a movie in his little trench coat and fedora, he goes and sees critters. And when he walks out, he's like, how did they come up with this stuff? And it's critters, and here's a talking turtle. Anyway, I digress. All right, so let's listen to what our critics had to say about this. Roger brought this to the show.
Our next movie is named Critters, and there are whole sections of this movie that look strangely familiar, especially if you've seen Gremlins or The Terminator. This movie seems to be inspired in about equal parts by those two other films, but that doesn't make it a bad movie. In fact, I sort of like Critters. The movie tells the story of some small-town folks who get invaded by nasty little beasties from outer space that seem to be made up mostly out of rows of very sharp teeth. This movie is not about some horrible, terrible menace that's going to destroy the earth. It's more like the attack of the flying squirrels, and the bounty hunters are like a couple of good old boys who want to chase them and blow them up real good. There are some good performances in the movie, especially by M. Emmett Walsh as the local sheriff, and Scott Grimes as the little kid who tries to protect his family from the critters. The movie has a couple of big laughs and a few scary moments, and although it's not a great film, I liked it enough to say thumbs up.
I was surprised at that one, dude.
I'm surprised with both of them, but I'm surprised at this one, especially with his honesty saying it's not a good film, but I'm going to recommend it because, we have those movies. We've had these discussions where it's about the intent of, is it there to entertain an audience? Is it there to be art? Is it there to kind of deliver a message? This one teeters just as a B movie, as a midnight movie, as just trying to appease the audience. That tells a tale of where our director's career is going to go because that was his true intent. This is just a crowd pleaser that wants you to enjoy the ride. And Roger admits it, he gets it, and he's right.
I think there's definitely like a nostalgia thing going on with him because he loved like the old Captain Video serials. He liked the Val Lewton movies, like the George Powell movies. And this kind of is a shadow of those, right? That cheesy sci-fi, but it kind of takes itself seriously, like Them or the original Invaders from Mars, where it's kind of a laugh, but part of the laugh is the fact that the actors aren't treating it like a laugh. I think there's something very nostalgic to the era and the films that he liked so much that when he does see a movie that tries to echo that same energy but doesn't achieve what he's looking for, all he can do is say, it's just trying to be a ripoff of this and it's nowhere near as good. I think this pleasantly surprised him, where it really kind of brought that nostalgia of that 50s, let's say, matinee double feature he used to go see as a kid, where you'd see, okay, I'm going to go see War of the Worlds and Invaders from Mars, and this reminded me of that, but with modern sensibilities, with Terminator vibes, with some punk rock vibes, glam rock, or whatever it is Johnny Steele is, right? It's a lot of fun. And then bringing like that 80s wisecracking dialogue from Scott Grimes and from Charlie, yeah, they're great. I think that this worked for him in that particular thing, where movies like, I think want to say like Fright Night didn't really work for him in that way. They both kind of talked about that, where it was reaching for nostalgia or sullying the nostalgia they had for creature features and monster movies of their past.
100%. Because Roger, we've talked about this, is very nostalgic in his reviews. He'll take something from his childhood that he relates to and he'll love it. We see it primarily with family movies, but we see it here too, where if you would have taken out the first 10, 15 minutes of the movie and creatures just came down to earth and it was just kind of the same old killing spree with no background, no stakes, which I don't think they utilize it as much as they should. But this is what he relates to as something more, something different but familiar that he sees. And I love when he uses the quote, the good old boys, because that is a direct reflection to how he feels about movies of the past, where I don't know if I would necessarily compare it to Terminator just because of a single scene that does feel familiar, because there's 100 different movies that I was reminded of, like I spoke to earlier, like
Mhm.
Ghoulies, that does really reminisce this kind of movie of just the fun factor without trying to compare it to some serious movies that are on a different level of what it's trying to do. So this one is goofy fun, but it's character driven, it's practical effects driven. And I think this is where Roger really did say, I'm not going to take this too seriously when it comes to what this movie is, because when it's marketed, this is what I think honest marketing was. They knew what they were getting into, and I think it put an exclamation mark on something more when we get the subtitle swearing aliens, when we get kind of the not showing the blood and guts. So it took Roger by surprise on what they're going to be versus the marketing. They had an idea, but they were taken by surprise on what it actually was presented on screen.
Yeah, it reminds me a lot of Joe Dante's Piranha, but on land, right? Like it's got the same kind of comedy vibe to it. It's got the same kind of cruelty, but also takes itself a little bit seriously. It does feel like a Joe Dante movie, but he'd already made Gremlins, so he couldn't make this one, right? So you just get them into a Gremlin vibe, a Piranha vibe, but kind of do its own thing with it. Now, so that surprised me, but I tell you what, Gene surprised me even more.
I like Critters too, except I had one objection to the film. I didn't like the bondage act that one of the critters did in the strip scene in the film. Yes, that's right. That's a joke from the first segment. Okay, thank you. You know, I like the film for the same reasons you did. Normally what we get are these creatures from outer space coming in, tearing up the people in planet Earth, and then fighting and see who wins. This film says, forget the people pretty much on planet Earth. Let the aliens fight it out themselves. They got these little bowling balls with teeth going, and these monsters going after them, the bounty hunters, you call them. Mm-hmm. And that, for me, was kind of fun. We're sort of innocent bystanders to this whole action, which, if I were a teenager, I just ate up. And I enjoyed it as a double teenager.
I like the way the movie was able to go back and forth between what is obviously supposed to be a science fiction thriller and the other part, which is kind of a down-home comedy. And there are some lines in the movie that, because they're unexpected, you know what I'm thinking of, are really funny.
Also, the violence is handled off camera, which is nice for a change. Why do we have so much blood and guts? This film was smart enough to have a little off camera. I like that, too.
It was also smart enough to have a little on camera, too.
That's what won him, man. The fact that it wasn't, like he said with the hidden, gloppy, the glop in science fiction creature movies. There's none of that here. It's all off camera. A lot of it done with sound effects, like the squishy, eaty, toothy sound effects. Like, I think that's like what you talked about Reservoir Dogs, the insinuation of violence where you don't necessarily see it, but it's visceral because you can hear it and your mind paints the picture. That's what he liked. I think that's what won him over. He already liked the idea of throwback 50s and then like a little bit of a Terminator in there and then having like the down-home comedy, almost like the Andy Griffith show going on in the town while there is bounty hunters and bowling balls with teeth. He liked all that. But what won him over is in that last sentence. It wasn't overly violent. It wasn't bloody, gory, or gloppy. It just insinuated the violence. He didn't have to sit there and see it. Therefore, he didn't have to call it a terrible movie like he's done so many of them before, or a violent and overreaching excess of gore like slasher movies. He sanitized it up and he'll be down.
100%, because this one, I think, does a great job on, again, like I said earlier, winking at the adolescent audience on, we know kids of the 80s, you and me are the same way. We tried to find every horror movie we can to get our eyes on. Nobody is different in this aspect if you grew up in the 80s. We tried that taboo. We wanted to see almost every movie that wasn't allowed for us, and this one knew it. And I think in a movie like this where we've seen or heard time over time where we compare it to Close Counters, we compare it to Aliens, we compare it to E.T. that Gene notoriously always does. And I think this is where it won him over, is that it has fun with that. We even see a critter eat an E.T. doll that has some fun with it. So I think that's what really won him over, is little nuggets of this that really doesn't try to be anything other than just something that's tame, but a little edgy for the teenage audience to get butts in chairs. And with that, it's still reminiscent to those that respected or grew up in the 40s, 50s, 60s when it comes to sci-fi. It adds a little bit of everything for, I don't want to call it a family film, but you know what? This does have elements here where you can just have a good time sitting on the couch, eating popcorn and enjoying it without a gore fest or without having kids like wake up in the middle of the night. This was tame enough to an extent to really have that family element to have a scary movie.
And I think that's just the brilliance of New Line cinema in the 80s. Before they started doing all these blockbusters in the late 90s and early 2000s, the New Line movies, especially the horror movies, even if they were R, even if they were an aggressive R rating, they still had a lot of whimsy to them, like Alone in the Dark and all the Nightmare on Elm Street movies and the Critters films and The Hidden. Like they're horror movies, they're body horror movies, they're sci-fi movies, but the sense of fantasy and whimsy, I think, is what kind of really put the stamp on a New Line picture during this decade and into the early 90s. And the idea that it's like, hey, we don't have to break the bank. Let's make our money back. Let's make a little bit of money on video, and then we'll make another one. And maybe that fourth one will just go straight to video like it did. We are still putting out content. And I love studios that are in it just to continue making content, not just like essentially making these bloated commercials just for return and receipts. Like, I always appreciate a studio whose main goal is to always be creating, not just manufacturing and putting it out there, but creating. And I think New Line was just a masterclass of that in the 80s.
Well, and I think this is where I want to say I miss a lot of this, and I miss where movies are going, because I've said it on my show. We see a lot of emotional horror. We see a lot of gore horror, but we don't have anything that's in between for those that really want to experience something on just the fun level. And we saw it a little bit in the early 2000s with some films, like I spoke to earlier with Eight-Legged Freaks, that poke fun with a little bit of thrills, with a little bit of humor. But we need filmmakers now that really can teeter and balance properly the fun factor, the scare factor, the thrill factor. And here, which does it brilliantly, is for every scary moment, there is a family element. There is a caring moment where you see the family hugging or giving a line of dialogue of concern on what they're going to do next. And that's the empowerment I think this movie does well, is it balances the dialogue, the family element versus the scares. Obviously, a mother and a father is going to care for their kids, but this is a whole unit that we see more times than not gathered together in huddle that are trying to create a plan. They're trying to survive. So I think that's where this movie really does stay above the rest, that we should take note of this for filmmakers going forward, that you can have a scary movie, but you need a united front when it comes to a family element to give comfort for those that are being introduced to a scary movie or a thrilling movie. And I think that's a missing piece that we see. And Critters is a prime example of that.
I mean, it's literally the only reason why I give M. Night Shyamalan's Signs a pass, are the family scenes. Everything else in that movie can fuck off, but the family moments with the kids, and especially them wearing the tinfoil hats, that kind of stuff, that's so reminiscent of what this does. And if he would have just stuck with that shit and not had to get all M. Night on it, I would have liked Signs a lot better. But of course, he had to do his M. Night shit. But yeah, you're 100% right. This formula, the family at a farmhouse, whether it's zombies, whether it's ghosts, whether it's alien creatures, that formula works. And yeah, I haven't seen a farmhouse horror in a hot minute, and I'm ready for another one. We're done with cabins. Cabins have been done to death. Let's bring back farmhouses, right? Awesome. Okay, so like I think with my guy, all right, so this movie is a solid B for me. It's not an A movie. It's a solid B. I love it. It's on the shelf. The box set's on the shelf. So I think with that, I'm gonna have to give my dude a B. I like he likes this movie, but his review of the movie is just on the par of good but not great, just like the movie is. And I think that's worth a B in my opinion.
This one, I'm going to be really generous, and I might get some pushback on this because what I loved about Roger's review is it is upfront on center on who
Yes,
he is as a critic.
I agree with you on that.
He recognizes that it's not a good movie, but you don't have to stick to a certain criteria. Is it fun? It's about the intent. Do you recognize the flaws? But at the end of the day, was the intent clear enough for you to have a good time? And he made that clear, and he even added subtext to it with wording like the good boys or just the humor of it. So to me, I'm going to be generous at 3.5 stars because this one was a complete, honest review. What people watch, of what people are expected going in. Is it a good movie? No. But will you have a good time? And this one should be in the record of our director going forward of he is an audience director of somebody that is intended to have a good time, not to win awards. And I think this is going to be a good clip for Roger. If you haven't seen it yet, or if you haven't listened to it yet, this is the clip for him on just based on our director of who he is.
Right. And like you can't see the video like I have played here on your end of the camera, but he's giddy and smiling throughout his whole review. It just goes to show that the nostalgia of this to the movies he grew up with is very evident, not just in the context of his review, but in his face. Where Gene, he liked the movie, but I'm telling you, the main conceit of him liking this movie is the fact that it wasn't gory. That we could have a sci-fi horror without all the gore, because he's a fucking prude. But I'll take it. I'll take him at his prudishness and his thumbs up for Critters. I had no idea Critters was a 2 thumbs up movie, and it just makes me giddy inside.
I absolutely love it, because this is the one review I didn't watch, and I didn't watch it until I was done with my review, and I was pleasantly surprised with it, because for sure, I thought Gene was going to be the big thumbs down, but there was hints that Roger would like it based on the sci-fi aspect of it. So
yeah.
I was surprised with it.
Cool. No, it made me happy that they liked it. Okay, so next week, continuing on with our October Fright Fest of films, we have George Romero's Monkey Shines. I just remember the trailer scaring the hell out of me when I was a kid, but it wasn't for a few more years I was able to actually watch the movie, and I've rewatched it several times, and I'm curious to hear what your modern day take on the film is. I'll definitely tell you mine, but again, I have no idea what these guys thought, so we're gonna have to find out next week. So with that, please like, rate, review, subscribe to our show on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Follow our YouTube channel, write a review, give us a like, subscribe to that as well. You can find me, Antonio, at thecultworthy.com. You can find my co-host Justin over at
themoviewire.com.
And we'll see you next week.
See you next week.